Hello, I'm George Liston, CA, and welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. With the collapse of communism, Bulgaria, like its East European neighbors, entered a period of profound political and economic transition. Bulgarians call this new reality the changes. The effect of these changes and the power of this transformation is expressed not in bloodless abstract theory, but in the lived experience of Bulgarians as they cope with altered rules and uncertain outcomes. The story is complex, and the place of Bulgarian women in that story is powerful, little understood, and illustrative of a reality and a history that defies easy assumptions about what best serves Bulgaria as it copes with this historic challenge. My guest is Kristen Ghodsee, author of The Red Riviera, who is also professor of gender and women's studies at Bowdoin College and a current fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Kristen, welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks for having me.
I think, let me hold up this handsome volume so that everyone can see it, Kristen, and congratulate you on it. And also say that I think it's going to be a revelation to many here that there is a Red Riviera.
That's right.
And you and I are going to explore it, and the book's a marvelous way of doing it, I must say. Largely because it's written about real people.
Right.
And you introduce a stunning cast, primarily women, of course, because it focuses on women and their achievements in the tourist industry. I want to begin my first question, Kristen, with one of them, a very young woman named Svetla, who we meet in the first pages, and we'll sort of see her later in the book as well. She's studying for a university entrance examination in tourism. And her parents are worried about this. And here's what they say, and I think this will just really stun everyone watching, as it did me. Her parents are worried, and quote, they would have preferred an easier examination like law or medicine. I think that resonates. And I'd love for you to tell us why. And why is tourism so distinctive, so difficult, and such a matter of prestige?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And this is the question that makes actually Bulgaria quite unique. Bulgaria, unlike a lot of other countries, particularly communist countries, developed its tourism sector primarily under communism. So it was profiled during the Soviet times. The Comecon was the communist trading bloc.
Right.
And Bulgaria became profiled as the country where socialist tourists would be able to holiday.
Sort of the workers' paradise thing?
The workers' paradise, the Red Riviera, exactly. They Czech intellectuals, Polish intellectuals, previous generations of intellectuals and bourgeoisie who had been used to holidaying on the Riviera in France or in Spain were no longer allowed to go to the West after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And so Bulgaria became the alternative.
Right.
And it was developed in a way to sort of take over the role of these places. Lenin also had very strong ideas about leisure, and that leisure should not only be the purview of the upper classes, that in fact workers should have leisure.
So what we have here is a long history of Bulgarian involvement in tourism.
Exactly.
And I guess the country is topographically favored for this?
Exactly. It has a very long coast on the Black Sea. It has fabulous mountain resorts. It also has balneological resources, or hot springs, quite diverse mineral waters that even since Roman times, Bulgaria had baths for Roman centurions who were passing through. So quite long history of tourism, but really only commercially developed, interestingly, under communism. And because it was developed under communism, tourism was a very prestigious subject to study in schools, usually associated with a geography department or an economics department.
Now, and that's a very helpful answer, both in terms of the history and the prestige and the way that communism saw tourism. Then, of course, now the $64,000 question, Kristen, is how did women get to be so prominent in that industry?
Right.
We're not used to thinking of women getting to be prominent and automatically in things that carry such prestige.
Right, and this comes back to the quote that you used about law and medicine. Under communism, interestingly, all of the services, things that we think of as white-collar professional jobs, were actually heavily feminized under communism because the communists did not value labor in white-collar professions. Things like law, medicine, banking, finance, tourism, things that we would consider quite prestigious, maybe with the exception of tourism, were very heavily gendered under communism because men tended to be educated at technical schools to work in Bulgarian industry and or professions which were very highly valued by the communists, things like mining, things like engineering. Wages in those sectors were higher, largely because they were very masculine professions, but also because the communists placed a high value on industrial production, as all communist societies did.
So this focus on industrialization kind of left the field open to women who were encouraged to take high administrative posts in tourism?
Exactly. Women tended to go to university as opposed to technical colleges. And with a university education, you tended to specialize in things like law or medicine or tourism, economics, geography. And because they had that education and because they were considered secondary positions under communism, women moved into those fields and dominated those fields. And this wasn't only true of Bulgaria, this was true of quite a number of communist countries.
What happens, Kristen, to this story at the very point of the transition, 89, 90? In other words, when the communist influence is no longer there, does the primacy of, well, does the importance of tourism continue, or does the primacy of women in it continue?
Absolutely.
It does.
It's exactly at this moment of time that Bulgaria's heavy industry is decimated by Bulgaria's insertion into the global economy. So Bulgaria actually had quite a good industrial base under communism. However, it was very heavily dependent on the Comecon, this communist trading bloc, and the Soviet Union as a trading partner. Something like 75% of its exports and imports are going in and out of the Comecon. When that establishment, the whole kind of infrastructure of communist trading bloc collapses, which it begins to in 89, but the sort of the nail in the coffin isn't really driven until 91, Bulgaria's industry is almost decimated overnight. And so all of these men who had previously been employed in very prestigious positions in industry and or mining or engineering, Bulgaria had petrochemical exports, armaments, computers even. The first Soviet computer was the Pravets, which was made in Bulgaria.
So these heavily male professions, these industries are in trouble.
Exactly.
Tourism is continuing. But here's a question on it, because it continues. Does it continue to have, let me see if I can phrase this the way I'm thinking about it, Kristen. I got the impression that when tourism was at its peak, even under communism, and it was something like 5% of the economy. It was very important. But that it was something of a cash cow, if you will.
Absolutely.
Its proceeds were being used for the industrialization. So does its character change after the transition? I mean, is it still a cash cow, or did the Bulgarian government come to see it as, yes, this is a major important thing for us in its own right? This is worth encouraging.
Absolutely. Well, it's kind of an interesting story, because what happens with tourism, which again was sort of the hidden export, as it was called. Under communism, it was the second largest generator of hard currency for the country. And so in terms of industrialization, tourism bankrolled a lot of Bulgarian industrialization. So the state was actually taking money out of profits, out of tourism, and redistributing elsewhere in the economy. After communism ends, the state is sort of forced, in many ways, by Western governments to dismantle all of these state-owned enterprises, of which Balkan Tourist, which was the communist Bulgarian enterprise in charge of tourism, was one. And as that broke up, individual managers within tourism, who had for so long seen their profits extracted to help bankroll other parts of the Bulgarian economy, really begin to try to hoard those profits for themselves. And for the first time, there's a profit motive in tourism, which, for better or worse, actually increases the visibility of tourism in the Bulgarian economy, and in fact, perhaps in some ways actually begins to increase standards.
Increase standards, increase visibility, and perhaps complicate our story a little bit, Kristen, because as you pointed out, women got into this field and got the reputation, the training, and the positions under communism. Now, in this post-communist era, we're getting the visibility, the heightened attention to it. But as Svetla's dilemma indicates, isn't it also making the university access to get into this now much more difficult? Much less guaranteed than it was?
This is, in fact, the biggest problem, I think, that the book points out, is that for the generation of women that were raised under communism and had their education and training and work experience under communism in tourism, they were incredibly well positioned to take advantage of the changes that occur after 1989. They have foreign language skills, they have general education, they have an already existing position with many years' experience in an industry which was always in some ways associated with the West.
Right.
These women had spoken to Westerners. They had an idea of how capitalism worked. They had an idea of what capitalism was like, as opposed to many other people in the Bulgarian economy. The key thing about those women, however, is that it wasn't that capitalism gave them new opportunities. They had pre-existing skills that they had actually got under communism, particularly in terms of general education. That young women like Svetla no longer have access to.
That easily.
That easily. I mean, the whole system of education, which was quite a good one under communism, has fallen apart because of contraction of state budgets for a whole variety of reasons, which I go into in the book. But young women like Svetla, women with promise, women who are smart, who are hardworking, who are willing. I think in the book she, studies for this exam day in and day out. All of her free time is encompassed with passing the tourism entrance exam, which is why her parents tell her to why don't you take law or medicine? It would be easier than trying to get into tourism.
What she's trying to accumulate and what the book brings out and what you have just told us in terms of the older generation of women that got it as they progress through the industry is the cultural capital that you explain as being so important in this book. I wanted to get your definition of cultural capital, political capital, and social capital in just a moment. Before that, though, and to set the stage fully for those watching, tell us a little bit about Bulgaria. The book takes us right into the streets of Sofia. And if you just had a moment or two to describe this mix of the traditional, the sophisticated, and as I think, perhaps the sinister that's going on there, how would you characterize Bulgaria today?
Wow. In a way, you're asking a very biased, somebody with a biased opinion, because I've spent a lot of time in Bulgaria. I love the place.
You're married to Bulgaria.
Exactly. And I have family there. I have plenty of friends there. I have a lot of connections. And so it's hard for me to paint the picture objectively. Let's just put it that way, particularly for Americans who have never
But you can do it empathetically.
But I can do it empathetically, absolutely. And Bulgaria is an amazing place full of contradictions. It was largely a peasant society before 1945 when the communists came into power. It had previously been under the Ottoman Empire. So even though it's predominantly Christian Orthodox country, it has a 12% Muslim minority. It's also about to be a member of the European Union in the next year or two. So in some ways, Bulgaria really quite benefited from communism in a way that countries, let's say like the Czech Republic or Poland or Hungary, really didn't or didn't feel they did. Bulgaria never had an uprising. They never rejected the Soviet tutelage. So when communism fell, it was sort of a free-for-all. Here you have a society of people who for 45 years largely many of them believe very strongly in the goals of communism. And more importantly, they believe that capitalism as an ideological structure was inherently corrupt, and that only the bad are the ones who would benefit in a capitalist world. And so you have this society which achieved so much in 45 years, in 40 years or so, through communism, industrialized the country, built these beautiful cities, built these industries, increased living standards. And then you have the insertion of Bulgaria as a very small state on the margins of Europe into the global economy in the early 90s. And throughout the 90s, you had banking collapses, economic collapses, this utter sort of chaos, almost close to famines at a certain point.
I think you call it a transformation of wolves. I mean, there's a lot of predatory.
You've got the creation of the Mafia, institutions that didn't exist in Bulgaria, obviously, during communism. You have this sort of internal predatory privatization going on. You've got Western European companies and American companies coming in and dismantling these enterprises for the sole purpose of closing them down. And so what you have is this sort of almost moral abyss in Bulgaria, which is evident in everything that you see when you go to a place like Sofia. So you'll see streets, beautiful streets with all of the latest European fashion boutiques, Krizia, Max Mara, Versace. And then, on a block away, you'll see pensioners, these are not street people, but just old people who
Right.
can't live on their pensions in the dumpsters looking for food to eat,
Wow.
right? The contrasts, you can go to Bowdoin, which is the ski resort, this beautiful, wonderful modern ski resort, and then on your way back, you'll pass by a little village, one called Zlokuchene, where they have to turn all of their electricity off at night because they can't afford to pay their bills, where the roads have just gone.
Right.
Amazing contrasts in the country, immense polarization of income.
With this immense polarization and things being tossed in such flux, and for so long a time, we're talking about a decade and a half, really, aren't we? I mean,
Right.
I mean, it's
15,
what we
yeah.
call a transition really is an era when you get down to that they're
Right.
going through. And it seems to me from what you said, Kristen, a lot of things can't be counted on. For example, you mentioned the Mafia. In the book they come through is very powerful, almost in many ways a rival to the government in terms of what gets done and what doesn't get done.
Well, a lot of people in Bulgaria will tell you that those two things are one and the
same.
I think that it's been a very difficult transition. Certainly private capital has amassed to those who we would consider members of organized criminal organizations. There's no doubt about that. A lot of those people have now tried to go legitimate, and really it's not that different from the robber barons in our early history.
Our late 19th century.
Exactly. So, capitalism does have a way of establishing itself on the backs of what we would consider these days corruption and criminal
Right.
activity.
In this world of tumult, confusion, chaos, and such, returning to the position of women, what's thrown up? I mean, what can be counted upon? For example, the women we were talking about in the tourism industry.
Right.
Is that still a bastion of stability? Is it a model for the future? How does it play out in this kind of melange of threat, confusion, and despair?
Right. I mean, I think the short answer to that question is not much can really be counted on. In terms of larger political, economic, and social structures in society. All of those things are in flux. And what I tried to show, however, in the book is that did not disproportionately hurt women in the way that many people believed that it would.
Many Western people.
Right, Western scholars in particular. That women in Bulgaria, particularly these women employed in the tourism sector, had the skills, had pre-existing knowledge and experience necessary in the stuff that they needed, basically, the package of goods, if you want to think of capital, as you said, social, economic, and political capital, and cultural capital, that allowed them to kind of ride through this transition period. And mostly it was because of two things. One was education. I think that education is something that cannot be undervalued in this situation, particularly foreign language experience, particularly experience with Westerners. But more importantly, networks, pre-existing networks within tourism.
Let me ask you a series of questions about that. Now, you paint a picture, Kristen, of a kind of a cadre, if you will, of women who equip themselves really admirably to live in a very uncertain world. A couple of questions on it. As a cadre, are they taking it one step further? Is there any sort of, we have a lot of truly compelling individual stories here. And particularly one I was struck by, a woman who's very entrepreneurial, ended up forming her own company. And the question that occurred to me then and now as you speak is, do they take that one step further to some kind of formal union? I mean, do they say, look, we're in this together, these are the strengths we have, and we're aging, and the youngers, the Svetlas are coming, what can we do? Does that happen?
Unfortunately, not yet. I mean, there are some associations, professional associations of travel agents, for instance, or hoteliers and restaurateurs. But in terms of just tourism employees, unfortunately, no. And that's one of the things that I advocate for in the book. I do think that would help women incredibly. Right now, it's sort of haphazard. People are trying, they have a sense, the women that I spoke with have a sense that there is this sort of incursion that's going to happen if they don't kind of stake out this territory. And actually right now, as we speak, there are laws on the books that require that in order to be a manager of a hotel, for instance, you have to have a certain level of education and you have to speak a certain number of foreign languages, which disproportionately biases hiring decisions towards women because women have that education. Now, the problem, of course, is with Svetla. If women are being forced out of these educational opportunities for a wide variety of reasons, largely because of class and economic issues, then those hiring decisions will be made differently in the future. And that's where this very dynamic industry, which is still one of the largest generators of hard currency in Bulgaria, it's like 12% of their GDP. It's only set to grow larger.
Yeah, but as you point out, the changes you allude to, what may happen in the future because of many things, and because there's so much male unemployment,
exactly.
is of course the threat that women are going to find themselves excluded, or that kind of pressure can grow. And I think one of the things you're pointing out here, with Bulgaria's sense of people uniting as a class around their industry, this is a good time for kind of the hotel workers or the hotel thing to become a unified presence, which it would sort of, it's a class interest or a professional interest, but it's obviously largely a female.
A gendered interest, absolutely.
Gendered interest,
And in fact, one of the things that I argue in the book is that if, non-governmental organizations or feminist organizations really want to support women, then they need to sort of rethink the way that they organize them.
Let's talk about that, because the book does raise some serious indictments about how people are thinking in the first place, particularly Western organizations.
Absolutely.
And in your concluding chapters, we get some very powerful statements about Western feminism and its, quote, take on Bulgaria. What's wrong with it?
Well, there are a lot of things that are wrong with it. But the key thing, I think, is that these are maybe 2 or 3 generations of women that were raised under socialism with a different ideology about women's empowerment than we in the West have. Socialist feminism clearly tends to view men more as equals, as partners in a class struggle against those who are economically oppressing them. And so when Western organizations come in and try to say that men are the enemy and that women need to unite against patriarchy, for instance, and organize against sort of the immediate conditions of their oppression, domestic violence or sexual harassment or a variety of other issues that sort of get imported from the West. What they're missing is that the thing that women are most concerned about in Bulgaria right now is unemployment.
Yeah, there's I can't resist this, because the book is filled with not just people but incidents, and there's a very novelistic quality to the characterization of things. And in one place, Bulgarian women are listening to an outside expert tell them things, and one woman says very pointedly, "I don't need another workshop, I need work." Right.
Exactly. And a lot of this has to do with sort of the historical moment that communism collapsed in '89. And unions in general are a scary thing in Eastern Europe still, right? If you think about the power of unions, successful unions in particular, they can bring down governments. And in the early '90s, some of the big unions actually were very instrumental in bringing down early post-communist governments. So there is a generalized fear. There's also a fear of class consciousness. Let's not forget that these are countries that lived and breathed Marxist-Leninism for a long time, and they were our enemy.
The remedy, Kristen, that you're clearly driving at here and in the book is that there should be NGOs formed that are Bulgarian in nature and character, oriented toward specific questions of employment, for example.
Right, and education.
My question to you, Kristen Ghodsee, after reading the book and thinking about this is, good. How will they get the support they need to do that? I mean, because what makes the outside influence so powerful, obviously, is the money that
the funding. Yeah. I mean, at this point, it's very difficult for NGOs that try to push an alternative agenda, for instance, one that focuses on education and or employment, to get any sort of outside funding from the West. Western funding is very clearly driven by issues that Western governments find pressing in terms of gender. Trafficking in women is one of the really hot ones right now. For a while, it was domestic violence. Legislation to somehow equal equality, what do you call it? I can't remember what it's called. Legislation that basically reifies in the law that men and women are equal. Anti-discrimination legislation, for instance, which then makes discrimination something that has to be dealt with in the courts. Those are the kinds of things that the West is really concerned about, to make sure that it's a level playing field. But when it comes to actually sitting down and saying, well, these women need jobs. They actually need to work. Even if their partners or husbands are employed, the wages that those men are making, that the men are making aren't enough to support these families. So there needs to be sort of an engagement here with the actual material conditions of women's lives. Not, I mean, I think that most Bulgarian women would say, look, I wouldn't mind being sexual harassed if I had a job to go to.
In the first place.
In the first place, right? I mean, that assumes employment in some ways, right? So it's not that those issues aren't important. Certainly they're very important issues, and I don't mean to downplay them. But what happens when these things come in from the West, they're imported into the post-socialist context, there's not a sense of what the women on the ground really need. And these women are smart, they're educated, they could do these things, but they don't have the support to do them, and they're not going to get it from the government. There isn't a culture of charitable organizations yet in Bulgaria, and certainly Western non-governmental organizations or international feminist organizations aren't going to be handing out funds.
This comes through very loud and clear in the book, Kristen. And as we come to the conclusion of our conversation, the impression I'm left with at the end of this book, and I want to get you to comment upon, however briefly, at the end of this, now, at the end of our conversation, is this. It seems to stress to me the importance of just what we have here, that is to say, a sociology, cultural anthropology, ethnography, the things that tell us how lives are lived on the ground, so to speak, what people are up against as well as what they're up to. Do you get that sense too, that there needs to be a lot more scholarship like this? I kept wondering, if I know this little about Bulgaria, I know what else is certain about the transition anywhere else.
Right. I mean, I think that's absolutely, I mean, there's a wonderful body of literature right now that's emerging, which is good ethnographies of the post-socialist context, actually talking to people living in these communities. Not only asking people what their lives are like, but actually seeing them stand in line at the butcher counter and have to choose a cheaper cut of meat.
I hope we get a lot more of this. I hope we get a lot more of it from you, Chris. I know you're off to Princeton.
That's right.
Very
That's right.
soon,
I'll be there next year. Yeah.
Keep writing.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful to be here.
And come back and talk with us when you do.
Yes, please. Thank you.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. Thank you, Kristen.